John Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Thanks for joining us for Newsmaker. We pride ourselves on this program to bring you a wide diversity and variety of subjects, and tonight is no exception. You may not realize it, it kind of passed quietly, but last month marked the 50 years since President Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace, brought down by the scandal of Watergate. 50 years later, do we have the full story of what happened? Geoff Shepard was the youngest lawyer on Nixon's White House staff. He was 24 years old at the time when he was hired. He worked with all of the principals involved in the Watergate scandal. He transcribed the so-called smoking gun tape, the recording from the White House, in which President Nixon appeared to have ordered a cover-up of the Watergate burglary, which got it all started. Geoff Shepard says history may have gotten much of this story wrong. He's the author of the Real Watergate Scandal and the Nixon Conspiracy, Watergate and the Plot to Remove the President. Geoff Shepard, my guest on Newsmaker. Great to see you. Thank you.
John, it's good to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, this all begins in 1972, June 17th. There's a break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate complex. Yes. That starts the whole ball rolling. We'll get into what led up to that because some of these guys were up to dirty tricks, the plumbers, long before that. But that break-in, what was the reason for it originally?
Well, that's a terribly unfair question for you to ask, John, because nobody knows for sure. That remains, 50 years later, one of the unanswered mysteries of Watergate. Why did they do that? Why did they break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters when, as Nixon pointed out at the time, everybody knows it's the candidates who are making the decisions, not the DNC. And the head of the DNC had already left for the convention down in Miami. So they go in, and it's like the Keystone Cops. They mess it up 12 ways to Sunday. They get caught red-handed. And it turns out there are 4 Cuban Americans, and there's one guy who turns out to be a career CIA officer who was head of security for Nixon's re-election campaign.
So, Geoff, what is the CIA? What are a couple of CIA guys who are involved in this thing? What are they doing involved in a domestic issue and getting involved in what was described by Nixon's press secretary as a third-rate burglary? What are they doing?
Well, you see, you're just being continuously unfair, John. We don't know, but we do know 2 things. Everybody involved in that initial break-in had a CIA connection of some sort, except Gordon Liddy, who thought he was in charge of planning for the break-in. And the other thing we know for sure, even today, that Richard Nixon and his 2 top aides, Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, had no idea there was going to be a planned break-in at all. But who knew? Well, the CIA knew. They prepared the charts that Gordon Liddy used to explain his brilliant plan to John Mitchell when John Mitchell was Attorney General before he came over to take charge of the re-election committee. So your question is absolutely on the mark. What's the CIA doing in this thing at all? And how can we understand what was going on if the 4 Cubans had been involved in the ill-fated invasion of Cuba back in the early 1960s, and Gordon Liddy's compatriot in crime, Howard Hunt, was a separate career CIA agent. So this led to no end of speculation. There's a series of books over the years, I call them the Doubter books, that focus on that break-in and how everything went wrong. A police car was too close, got there quicker than it should have. The James McCord, who was the wire man, put the tape on the wrong door and put it on incorrectly and replaced it after it was taken off. I saw an oral history recently taken by the National Archives of the lead FBI agent from the day those guys were arrested, June 17th, till the end of Watergate, 2.5 years later. And he was asked about that day, and he said, well, it was the craziest thing. These guys had keys to 2 Watergate hotel rooms where they'd spent the night beforehand. And I went to one of the rooms, and laid out on the bed was everything you'd need to have to solve the crime. There was their ID, their driver's licenses, these uncirculated $100 bills.
Yep.
And we actually found a check from Howard Hunt, one of the masterminds, and we went over to his house that Saturday morning to interview him. Now, he wouldn't talk to us, but we basically had the crime solved the first day, and it's because it was all laid out. It was like it was a setup.
Now, Geoff, just to put this to rest, Richard Nixon knew, it's very clear in the record, he knew nothing about the break-in in advance. He didn't know anything about this.
Absolutely.
So when he's told about it, he had to be beside himself. This is an election that he was cruising to victory. It's the biggest landslide in electoral history against McGovern. They didn't need to do it. That's my point. And he must have been like, what are you guys up to? Why aren't we putting the stop to this stuff?
Well, he was down in Florida when these guys got arrested, so he reads about it in the Sunday paper. And he says, well, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. Now, he didn't know then, because he knows nothing about this. He didn't know it was his committee that planned it. He didn't realize it was some of his people who were responsible. But you have exactly what you put your finger on. He was cruising to victory over McGovern, but there's always an asterisk when you're dealing with President Nixon. He and his people were terrified that Teddy Kennedy would emerge at the convention and take the nomination without going through all the primaries.
Boy, this sounds familiar.
Now, John, we've just seen something very much like that, and you'll say, oh, that could never happen. That couldn't do. But you remember, Nixon lost to a Kennedy once, and he would get all over his people saying, you're taking too much for granted. You've got to worry about Ted Kennedy.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
So that may be, I don't know. Let's move on from this.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of unanswered questions about the break-in, but that's not what sunk his presidency. What sunk his presidency was the tapes and the special prosecutor and the way the story unfolded that ended up sinking President Nixon.
Now, you transcribed the tapes. It came out in the Senate hearings that Nixon had a tape system going on in the White House. I presume that was for his memoirs later, right, to preserve the record?
There's absolutely no question of that.
Okay.
He expected to write books when he left office. He was going to be a young former president, and he wanted an accurate record of what he had done so he could refer to it in secret, write his books, and then destroy the tapes.
Let me ask you about the 2 critical parts in that tape. You transcribed it. You're the 3rd person, I think, who ever heard it.
Yes.
Okay. It was revealed in those tapes, 2 critical discussions, as I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong. John Dean with the president telling him about hush money payments to the burglar team for the break-in. And Nixon is quoted as saying the money should be paid. Is that true or false?
There are 2 clarifications for you. There are really 3 key tapes. One is the 18-minute gap. We don't have to worry about that for now because we don't know what was on it. The second one is June 23rd, 6 days after the break-in, and that emerged at the very last minute in the Nixon's presidency, and that's called the smoking gun tape. And that's where Nixon concurs with Bob Haldeman's advice that's based on John Dean's decision that they don't want the FBI to interview these 2 people and they ought to get the CIA to tell them it's a CIA operation, lay off those two people.
Yeah, just to interrupt quickly, Haldeman is his chief of staff. John Dean is his White
lawyer.
House counsel. It's his lawyer.
John Dean is his lawyer.
Okay.
When we heard that tape on July 24th, 1974, the lawyers misunderstood what the tape meant. There's no question Nixon concurs in the use of the CIA to tell the FBI not to interview two people, open and shut. But it turns out that the reason we wanted to do that, or John Dean had suggested it, was because that would lead to disclosure of substantial campaign contributions by two very prominent Democrats who were playing both sides, giving money to both sides under the absolute assurance it would never become public. Now, there's a third key tape, and the third key tape is March 21st, 1973. That's where John Dean goes in to see the president for the first time and says, there's a lot been going on you don't know about, and you're going to have to make some pretty important decisions because we're being blackmailed. And people have already perjured themselves, but it's going to get a lot worse. Now, that's called the cancer on the presidency speech.
Yes.
And that was out and known for months. It was known to the public for the previous 6 months. It's an hour-and-a-half conversation. It's pretty clear. It's in the Oval Office. We can understand all the words. But what is difficult is the key part is at one point, Nixon says, how much would it cost if we paid these guys off? And Dean says it might amount to $1 million. And Nixon says, well, I know where we could get the money. Okay, so that's always quoted.
Yes.
But Nixon doesn't say, go get the money or make the payoff. So even as he's saying, it's not the amount of money, it's not the $1 million. It's that once we start, we can never stop. Once
Geoff,
you paid the first dime of blackmail, you can't get out from under it.
Yeah.
So if you study, and I just happen to have the transcript right here on my desk because I work on it all the time. But,
Geoff,
it's not Nixon's finest moment.
No.
But there's no decision made at that meeting except bring John Mitchell down from New York. Let's decide what to do. We're being blackmailed.
Geoff, do you believe that there was a deep state effort to try to rid the country of Richard Nixon?
Oh, without question. When Nixon gets inaugurated on January 20th, 1969, he is opposed by every institution in our nation's capital. Go back for a moment, all the way back to 1932, when Roosevelt gets elected, and they just wipe out the Republicans. I mean, they must have controlled 75% of both houses of Congress, and they maintained that control with minor exceptions all the way up through Nixon's election in '68. The one person who stood in the way of Democrat dominance was Richard Nixon. And they hated him ever since he was elected to Congress in 1946 when he bagged Alger Hiss, the liberal hero, and showed him to be a communist spy. I mean, Nixon, the man, knocked off Jerry Voorhees for Congress, who had been selected the most popular congressman by the Washington media, and Nixon took him out. Then he ran for the Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas, a Hollywood starlet who was carrying on this unbelievable public affair with Lyndon Johnson, and he beat her by 16 points. I mean, she called him Tricky Dicky. He said she was pink down to her underwear. He was the one person the Eastern liberal establishment hated. And to take him out would be delicious.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get into what you describe in your books as kind of the lawfare to get Nixon.
Sure.
And we'll get into that when we come back right here on Newsmaker. Back with Geoff Shepard, the youngest lawyer on Richard Nixon's White House staff. We're looking back at Watergate 50 years later. He's written extensive books on the subject, and that what we think we know about Watergate, we may not know a lot. There's a lot that's come out. Geoff, what's the biggest misconception of this entire affair?
Well, I think there's three of them, John. One is we misunderstood that smoking gun tape. It was misunderstood for 30 years, and then out of nowhere, John Dean, the president's worst enemy, his former lawyer, he says, "Oh, by the way, it's in a footnote in a book he wrote in 2014. That's been misunderstood from the get-go. That was really all about politics and political contributions." So you get past that, and then you go back to the Cancer on the Presidency speech, March 21st, 73, and you wrestle with the opponents saying, no, Nixon approved the payoff, and Nixon's defenders saying, no, he didn't. If you listen to the tape, he never approves it. The only decision is get Mitchell down to talk about it, and by that very afternoon, Nixon says, I know what we're going to do. We're going to beat Hunt's blackmail demand by disclosing ourselves what he's threatening to disclose. So he's going down an entire different path that the special prosecutors don't want you to know about.
When
Now,
you were, Geoff,
happened.
when you were there in the White House, was Nixon able to function as president and do his duties, or was he consumed by this in 72, 73, 74?
Well, there's this great line in one of the novels where the guy talks about his bankruptcy, and he says, well, it came slowly at first and then all of a sudden. And that's what happened to Nixon. He was coping with the onslaught of Watergate until right toward the end, you had the House Judiciary Committee vote to recommend articles of impeachment. Yes. You had the Supreme Court vote that all these additional tapes had to be turned over. The lawyers heard this one tape and they disclosed it and demanded it be disclosed. Now, at that moment, we disclosed the tape on August 5th, and he announced his resignation 3 days later. So the release of the smoking gun tape caused him to resign. But he was already on the ropes before that because the prosecutors had secretly told the House Judiciary Committee that Nixon had personally approved the payment of blackmail. They deliberately misread that tape of March 21st. Now, spend a second on this because it all involves human beings and foibles and all that. Dean comes in on that morning, says we're being blackmailed. News to the president. They'd never discussed specifics before. Both agreed. This is the first time Nixon ever was told anything about what was going on with the cover-up. That very night, 10 o'clock, a payment is made to Howard Hunt's lawyer. So the prosecutors say this is open and shut. He learns about it, the payoff occurs. But what the facts reveal is the decision to make that payoff, made by John Mitchell, is made before Nixon even hears about the demand. So he couldn't have been involved. But we didn't know they were accusing Nixon of having personally approved the payoff.
Geoff, how does John Dean become the hero out of all this? He was right in the middle of all of it. He was involved from the very beginning.
The lead FBI agent credits John Dean with 95% of the cover-up actions. The prosecutors wouldn't give him immunity. They said he was too deeply involved. So they went to the Senate Ervin Committee, the Senate, and they said, we'll give you immunity if you'll testify against Nixon and testify against his two top aides. So they had a reason to portray John Dean as a whistleblowing innocent, but he wasn't. He was the arch villain of the cover-up. The FBI called him the master manipulator of Watergate.
I want to spend a couple of seconds on the media. Woodward and Bernstein with the Washington Post are breaking all these stories. They've got a source that
Yes.
we're led to believe all the way along was someone within the White House, but it turns out it wasn't. It was a guy with the FBI, Mark Felt, who'd been
Yes.
passed over for Hoover's job when Hoover died.
Well, when you unpack that thought for a minute, the worst thing that Woodward and Bernstein did to America was encourage and allow people to believe Deep Throat was a member of Nixon's White House staff when they knew he wasn't. And the implication was the thieves in the White House were so prevalent that one person decided to bring it down. But that was just untrue. They knew that, and they allowed that to exist in the public for
Was that an
30
effort
years.
to protect Felt and their source, to kind of
Well,
misdirect?
that's what Woodward said, but that doesn't justify what he did. He allowed this misinformation, deliberately allowed it. If you go back and watch the movie, All the President's Men, and of course I have,
Oh, yeah.
after I learned Deep Throat was an FBI agent, and 3 different places in that movie, they indicate beyond any doubt Deep Throat works at the White House. I mean, they've got him in a phone booth. Remember phone booths, glass phone booths, out in front of the EOB.
Yeah.
And Woodward is talking to him at work. And Deep Throat says, "Don't ever call me at work." And he's looking up at the old EOB.
Yes.
It's just open and shut proof of who the source was. It was all a lie.
There was a lot of criminality going on within the Nixon White House. Whether he knew or not, it's hard. I mean, this is up for debate. But did he do the right thing by resigning, or do you think he should have tried to slug it out?
Well, let me peel you back one step. The criminality was at the re-election committee. Those of us that worked on the White House staff want you to believe it wasn't in the White House itself. They were Nixon people, but they were working at the re-election effort. Should he have resigned? Yes. After we released the smoking gun tape, wrongly interpreted, he lost the ability to govern. And resigning was the right thing to do at that moment. But we didn't know about all the cheating by the prosecutors, the ex parte meetings between the prosecutors and the judges, the suppression of exculpatory evidence that would have allowed the defense lawyers to destroy John Dean. All that was hidden from us, and that only came out in the last 10 years. So we've talked about this evolving story of Watergate. You don't see it the same way today as 50 years ago, and it starts with this new word in our lexicon, lawfare.
Yes.
And proper use of the criminal law to destroy your political enemy. We didn't have the word, but that's what they were doing back in Watergate.
We've got a minute, only a minute. What are the lessons, and how do they apply to where we are right now?
Well, we know now that they cheated, that the prosecutors cheated and the judges cheated. So to me, what's the next steps? We want the Department of Justice to investigate everything that I've uncovered. And we think when they do that, they'll have to come into court and disavow these verdicts. These verdicts are not obtained with due process of law. Second thing, the prosecutors went to the grand jury and they told the grand jurors they thought Nixon had personally committed crimes. That speech, that presentation to the grand jury has been secret for 50 years. We want that released because we don't think Nixon did any criminal conduct. Mistakes were made, judgments were wrong, we trusted the wrong people. But Nixon didn't break the law. Nixon acted honorably if you fully understand what was going on.
Geoff Shepard, lawyer on Nixon's White House staff, and the books are great reads. Let's just run through them. Author of The Real Watergate Scandal and The Nixon Conspiracy, Watergate and the Plot to Remove the President. Geoff, I wish we had an hour. Thank you so much.
Well, John, thank you for having me on. There's lots more to say at a future time.
We'll do it. Geoff Shepard. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker Saturday. We will see you next week on Newsmaker.